Before we eat dessert, I want everyone to raise a glass to Nora. My mother-in-law, Evelyn Mercer, stood at the head of the dining room table with one hand resting on a thick white binder. Around us, Graham's relatives, church friends, and people from the Mercer Family Foundation lifted their glasses. Evelyn smiled at me as if she were giving me an award. "To Allison's second chance," she said, "and to Nora for giving my daughter a kidney." The room burst into applause. I had never agreed to donate my kidney. My name is Nora Caldwell. I am 48, a county records supervisor, and I had been married to Evelyn's oldest son, Graham, for 6 years. I had spent most of those years trying to prove I was not the difficult outsider she seemed to expect me to become. When Graham's younger sister, Allison, became seriously ill, I agreed to preliminary donor screening because I cared about her and wanted to understand whether helping was even possible. That was all. Evelyn slid the binder toward me. My name was printed across the front above the words Allison's second chance. "I already made the recovery schedule," she said. I looked at Graham, waiting for him to correct her. Instead, my husband leaned close and whispered, "Please do not embarrass Mom in front of everyone." That hurt more than the applause. Evelyn had just announced a decision about my body, and Graham was worried about her humiliation. I left the binder untouched. On the drive home, I told Graham no one would speak for me again. Until I knew exactly who had said what, I was not going to another donor appointment. The next morning, Evelyn texted me a surgery preparation schedule. Then came one more line. Graham should remember that the Mercer Family Trust reviewed residential arrangements before the upcoming foundation benefit. The house Graham and I lived in belonged to that trust. For the first time, I understood that saying no might cost me far more than their approval. For the first time, I understood that saying no might cost me far more than their approval. That realization followed me into the kitchen the next morning, where Graham stood at the counter pretending to study the coffee maker. I set my phone between us with Evelyn's message still on the screen. "Tell her she was wrong," I said. Graham was my husband of 6 years, Evelyn's oldest son, and a man who could negotiate a difficult commercial lease without raising his voice. With his mother, though, he became careful in a way that made everyone else pay for the peace. I reminded him that I had agreed only to preliminary screening, not surgery, not a recovery plan, and certainly not a public announcement. He said he knew, then asked me to give Evelyn a few days because Allison was scared and their mother was scared. Correcting everyone immediately, he said, would make things worse. I asked what could be worse than a room full of people believing I had promised them a kidney. Graham rubbed both hands over his face. "Mom got excited when she heard the medical information," he said. I went still. I had never sent Evelyn any medical information. When I asked what he meant, he backed away from the phrase and said he must have assumed I had told her more than I remembered. I told him I wanted him to call Evelyn that morning and say plainly that I had not consented to donate. He promised to talk to her, but not while she was upset. By the time he left for work at the Mercer Company, nothing had been corrected. I was still the donor in everyone else's story, and my husband had just admitted his mother knew something I had never told her. A little after noon, Evelyn came through our front door carrying the same white binder from the dinner. She did not knock. She had always treated the trust-owned house as partly hers, because legally it was not ours. She set the binder on my dining table with a grocery list, meal suggestions, and a calendar marked for transportation, hospital visits, and what she called my recovery coverage. I told her there was no recovery to schedule because I had not agreed to surgery. Evelyn did not raise her voice. She looked wounded instead and said the family had already begun rearranging their lives because they trusted me. Then she reminded me of the reduced housing costs, Graham's secure job, repairs to the house, and other Mercer favors I had never asked to be counted. "Family takes care of family," she said. I heard the debt hidden inside the sentence. I pushed the binder back toward her. It opened crookedly, and I saw a tab printed with my full name. Beneath it were several lines of donor-related information, whose wording I recognized from my preliminary screening portal. My stomach tightened. I reached toward the page, but Evelyn closed the binder. She said Graham had helped gather planning material so she could keep everyone organized. I told her I had never authorized her to collect my medical information. She answered that I was making something loving sound ugly. Before leaving, she reminded me that the Family Foundation benefit was approaching, and Allison deserved to know where things stood before people started asking questions. She left the binder on my kitchen island. What had begun as a medical decision now felt tied to a public deadline Evelyn had chosen for me. I waited until her car was gone before I called the transplant program. I was transferred to Dana Ruiz, the independent living donor advocate assigned to me during my preliminary evaluation. Dana represented my interests as a potential donor, not Allison's and not the Mercer family's. I told her about the public announcement, the recovery schedule, and the donor information in Evelyn's binder. Dana did not discuss Allison's confidential treatment. She explained only what applied to me. Screening was not consent, evaluation was voluntary, and I could stop at any point without giving the family an explanation. Then she asked whether anyone had threatened my housing, marriage, employment, or finances because of donation. My first instinct was to say no. Naming pressure made it harder to excuse. But I pictured Evelyn's message about the Mercer Family Trust reviewing residential arrangements, and I read it to Dana exactly as it had been written. Dana said family disappointment and family coercion were not the same thing, and pressure tied to housing or money mattered. I wrote her words in my work notebook: voluntary pause, withdraw. Nobody outside the transplant team could promise my surgery for me. When I hung up, the white binder was still on the island. It looked less like an act of love than a file someone had opened on my life without permission. That evening, I told Graham I was delaying my next donor evaluation appointment until the pressure stopped. I said I was not making a final medical decision that night. I was setting a boundary. No more public announcements, no more schedules, no more private information passed around, and no more discussion of my body as if it belonged to the Mercer family. Graham stared at me, then said the foundation benefit was too close. Evelyn had already built part of the program around Allison's story, and people knew I was being evaluated. If I canceled now, he said, everyone would think I had changed my mind after letting Allison depend on me. I reminded him that Allison had never heard me promise anything, at least not from me. Graham said that was not the point. I told him it was exactly the point. He paced into the kitchen and stopped beside Evelyn's binder. For the first time, I noticed he did not seem surprised to see it. I asked again how his mother had gotten my preliminary information. He said she probably received more details than she should have because everyone had been trying to coordinate. Everyone? I asked. He looked away. I did not sleep much. After midnight, I sat at the kitchen table and searched backward through the Mercer family group messages. At work, when a county record does not match the story attached to it, I start with dates. Dates do not care who gets embarrassed. I searched the week of my preliminary screening and found one message from Evelyn that I had skimmed while working. It was dated several days before my preliminary results were complete. She had told the family that I had agreed to save Allison and that everyone should give me space while transplant details were finalized. I checked the date twice. At the time she sent it, I had not received a completed preliminary result. I had not promised Graham I would proceed. I had not told Evelyn I would donate. There had been nothing for her to misunderstand. She had created my consent before even I knew what the screening would show. I took screenshots and emailed copies to myself. My hands were shaking, but my thoughts were clear. The first lie had not happened at the anniversary dinner. The dinner had only made the lie public. Graham came into the kitchen before dawn and found me still there. I showed him Evelyn's message. He read it without speaking. I asked why his mother had announced my decision before there was any decision to announce. He said he did not know. I asked whether he had given her my medical information. "Nora, please, not now," he said. His phone buzzed on the table. Evelyn's name appeared on the screen. Graham read the message, and something in his face changed. I asked him to show me. He hesitated, then turned the phone around. Evelyn had written that if I walked back my commitment, she would have to reconsider whether a Mercer company manager, who could not keep his own household aligned, should continue benefiting from family housing. My right to say no still existed. Dana had made that clear. But Evelyn had built walls around it using our home, Graham's job, his loyalty, and the shame of disappointing a sick woman. For years, I had believed freedom meant nobody could physically force me to do something. Sitting at that table, I understood another kind of trap, making the cost of saying no so high that obedience began to look like the only safe door left open. Making obedience look like the only safe door did not make it consent. By the next morning, that was the sentence I kept repeating to myself. I did not argue with Graham before work. I opened the notebook I used for difficult records at the county office and began a timeline. My preliminary screening, Evelyn's first claim that I had agreed to donate, the anniversary dinner, the housing message, And every time Graham avoided explaining how his mother got my medical information. I wrote only what I had seen, heard, or received myself. That evening, Graham saw the notebook beside my laptop and asked whether I was building a case against his family. I told him I was trying to separate facts from fear. "You know what happened," he said. "Everybody got scared." I asked whether fear changed dates. He said I was treating people like paperwork. Maybe I was. At work, a missing signature could ruin a transfer years later. In my marriage, I was learning what happened when everyone trusted intentions more than a record. I opened the shared Mercer family calendar to confirm the date of Allison's next hospital appointment. Graham and I had been added months earlier so we could help with transportation. Scrolling backward, I noticed an old event labeled Paired Exchange Education. It was dated months before my donor screening. Allison's name was listed. So was Mark Ellis, Allison's fiancé, a self-employed electrician I knew from holidays and family dinners. I had never heard anyone mention him as a donor. I took a screenshot and called Allison. I told Graham's younger sister exactly what I had found and asked what the entry meant. After a long pause, she said Mark had gone with her to an information session because he wanted to see whether he could donate. He had volunteered, she said, but was not directly compatible with her. I asked what paired exchange meant. Allison explained that an incompatible donor might sometimes participate in an exchange, so the original recipient could receive a kidney from another compatible donor. She quickly added that nothing had been guaranteed. I told her I understood. Then I asked whether Evelyn knew Mark had volunteered. "She knew he went with me," Allison said before ending the call. That answer changed the shape of the problem. Evelyn had repeatedly told me Allison had no one else willing to help. I still did not know whether paired exchange was medically appropriate for Allison, and I would not pretend otherwise. Dana had already made clear that Allison's treatment details were not mine to demand. But I did know one simple fact. Mark had volunteered months before anyone tested me. I gave Evelyn one chance to correct the record. She came to the house 2 days later after Graham told her I was still postponing my evaluation. I asked whether anyone besides me had ever volunteered as a potential donor for Allison. Evelyn folded her hands over her purse and said no. She said people offered sympathy, but nobody had stepped forward when real sacrifice was required. I asked, "What about Mark?" Her face barely moved. She said Mark had never volunteered. I told her I had seen the paired exchange entry and had spoken directly with Allison. Evelyn's mouth tightened. She accused me of upsetting a sick woman by interrogating her. I said I had asked one question. Then she changed her wording. Mark had attended an educational meeting, she said, but that was not the same as being a real option. I reminded her that she had just told me he never volunteered. Evelyn stood and said, "A decent person would be asking how to save Allison, not looking for loopholes." That was the moment the lie became impossible to excuse as panic. Evelyn had looked at me and denied something Allison herself had confirmed. I still did not know why she needed me specifically, but I knew truth was no longer the language she expected to win with. After Evelyn left, Graham called from work and asked why I was pressuring Allison about transplant options. I told him exactly what I had asked. He said paired exchange was complicated and Mark might not even qualify. I asked how he knew that. After a pause, he admitted he had heard parts of the discussion months earlier, but had not paid attention because Evelyn was handling it. I told him every answer seemed to contain another answer hidden behind it. He said I was becoming suspicious of everything. I said suspicion was what remained when nobody answered a direct question the first time. That afternoon, Mark texted me and asked to meet somewhere away from the family. We chose a coffee shop near the interstate. Mark arrived first and told me he loved Allison and was not trying to start a war with Evelyn. He also explained why he had kept quiet. Since Allison's condition worsened, Evelyn had been helping with rides, household expenses, and costs surrounding treatment. According to Mark, whenever he challenged her, she reminded him that help could stop. He could cover his own bills, but Allison depended on more support than he could provide while missing work for appointments. I asked him one direct question. Had he actually volunteered to donate? Mark unlocked his phone and showed me an email from the transplant program. It was addressed to him and Allison and dated months before my screening. He let me read it and forwarded a copy to me. The message invited them to paired exchange education after his direct incompatibility had been identified. It did not promise a transplant or guarantee Allison any outcome, but it proved Mark had entered the donor process far enough for the program to discuss an alternative pathway. Halfway through our meeting, Allison came in. Mark had told her we were talking, and she said she did not want anyone discussing her life as if she were absent. I apologized for putting her in the middle. She shook her head and said her mother had already put everyone there. With Mark beside her, Allison confirmed that Evelyn knew about the email and knew Mark had volunteered. She said Evelyn had dismissed paired exchange as uncertain and later became convinced that testing me would be more direct. I asked whether Evelyn had ever told her I had definitely agreed. Allison looked down at her hands. She said Evelyn had spoken as though it was settled before Allison ever heard anything from me. "I thought you had told Graham," she said. "I told her I had not." For the first time since the anniversary dinner, I was sitting with people who did not ask me to ignore what I could see. That should have felt like relief. Instead, it made the distance between Graham and me feel sharper. I drove home with Mark's email printed and folded inside my purse. Graham was already there. I placed the copy on the kitchen table beside my timeline and asked him to read the date. He did. I told him Allison had confirmed Evelyn knew. I expected surprise. Instead, Graham sat down and said, "I knew Mark had looked into paired exchange." I asked when. Months ago. The room seemed to shrink around me. I asked why he had stood beside me, while Evelyn said I was Allison's only real chance. Graham said his mother thought paired exchange would be complicated. Then he added, almost as if he were explaining a scheduling choice, "She thought using you would be simpler for the family." Using me. I asked whether he understood that Evelyn had lied to my face about Mark volunteering. Graham said his mother was trying to keep Allison focused on what seemed most straightforward. I asked whether he could hear himself. His voice rose. His sister was sick. His mother was terrified. His job was under threat, and I was turning a terrible situation into a moral test nobody could pass. I told him I had asked for one thing, the truth before anyone demanded a piece of my body. "What do you want me to do, Nora?" he asked. I wanted him to say that what they had done was wrong without first calculating what it would cost him. I wanted him angry that his mother had spoken for me, threatened our home, and hidden another pathway. Instead, Graham was waiting for me to invent a solution that would let him avoid choosing. I closed the notebook. Until then, I had believed the worst danger was Evelyn's power over our housing and Graham's job. Sitting across from my husband, I understood the deeper isolation. Evelyn did not have to stand between us if Graham kept opening the door for her. The evidence on the table had finally given me something solid. It had also taken away the comfort of believing my husband simply did not know. The evidence on the table had finally given me something solid. It had also taken away the comfort of believing my husband simply did not know. For the next 2 days, Graham and I moved around each other like people sharing a waiting room. He slept in the guest room. I went to work, came home, ate when I was hungry, and stopped asking whether he planned to speak to Evelyn. Every time I looked at him, I heard the phrase he had used at our kitchen table, simpler for the family. I took control of the one thing that still behaved predictably, the record. I printed Evelyn's message announcing my supposed promise before my screening was complete, saved the shared calendar entry for paired exchange education, and, with Mark's permission, printed the dated transplant program email he had forwarded to me. Beneath each page, I wrote where it came from and when I received it. I kept the originals on my phone and copies outside the house because the house no longer felt like neutral ground. When Graham saw the folder beside my purse, he said I was building a case against his family. I told him I was preserving what I knew before anyone could tell me later that I remembered it wrong. He said families survived by forgiving mistakes, not documenting them. I asked when a mistake stopped being a mistake if the same person kept benefiting from it. He did not answer. The next morning, one phrase Evelyn had used began bothering me. At the anniversary dinner, she had spoken about Mercer women understanding sacrifice, and later she had said family had done this before. Until then, I had assumed she meant ordinary caregiving. Now I remembered Rebecca Cole, the former wife of Graham's older brother. I had met Rebecca only once, years earlier, at a funeral reception. Graham had identified her then as his former sister-in-law. The Mercer version of Rebecca was simple. She had become bitter after her marriage failed, cut everyone off, and left chaos behind. Evelyn called her unstable and ungrateful whenever her name surfaced. Years earlier, Graham had given me Rebecca's email address when I was sending holiday invitations, and the address was still in my contacts. I wrote to her carefully. I reminded her who I was and asked only whether she would answer one question about Evelyn's behavior during a family medical crisis. I told her she could ignore me and I would not contact her again. Her answer came that evening. No. I closed the message. Several hours later, another one arrived. Rebecca asked, "Has Evelyn threatened your home yet?" I stared at the words before telling her the truth. Evelyn had tied Graham's employment and our trust-owned house to what she called my commitment to Allison. Rebecca asked for my phone number. She called the next afternoon while I sat in my car during lunch. Rebecca told me she would speak once, provided I understood she had no interest in revenge against the Mercers. Then she asked whether Evelyn was asking me for a kidney. I asked how she knew. Rebecca said she did not know. She had guessed because Evelyn only became generous with the word sacrifice when she wanted something no decent person could comfortably demand. What came next was Rebecca's own account, and she was careful to identify it that way. Years earlier, when Graham's father was seriously ill, Rebecca had been evaluated as a possible living liver donor. She said Evelyn initially called the evaluation voluntary. Then the family began talking as if the surgery had already been settled. Rebecca and her husband were living in a Mercer-owned property at the time, and Evelyn was helping them financially while Graham's brother was between jobs. According to Rebecca, once she expressed doubts, Evelyn began reminding her what the family had provided and questioning whether a woman who accepted Mercer security truly belonged if she would not make a Mercer sacrifice. Rebecca eventually donated part of her liver. She would not discuss Graham's father's medical details, and I did not ask. She told me only about her own decision and recovery. After surgery, she struggled physically and emotionally. When she began refusing family demands while she healed, Evelyn started telling relatives that Rebecca had become selfish and unstable. Her marriage deteriorated, and by the time she left, the family's explanation for everything had already hardened around her. I asked whether anything from that period still existed besides memory. After a silence, Rebecca said yes. We met 2 days later at a diner well away from my office. Rebecca was 52, with gray beginning to show in her short hair and the guarded posture of someone who knew where every exit was. She brought an old tablet containing archived messages and copies of portions of her own recovery paperwork, enough to establish the timing of her surgery and follow-up care without exposing anyone else's medical records. Before she showed me anything, she said, "I am showing you this because it happened to me. You do not get to turn me into a character in their latest war." I promised I would not use anything without her permission. We went through the messages slowly. Some were ordinary offers of groceries, rides, and meals. Then the language changed. Evelyn wrote that frightened people sometimes needed help doing the right thing. In another message, she reminded Rebecca that Mercer money had kept a roof over her family's head. Then I read a sentence that made my stomach tighten. People who accept Mercer security must be willing to make Mercer sacrifices. I had heard almost the same thought in my own kitchen. Rebecca saw my face and asked whether Evelyn had said it to me too. I told her the wording had been different, but the meaning was close enough that coincidence no longer explained it. That was the darkest discovery so far. It did not merely show that Evelyn could be cruel under pressure. It showed a method. A medical crisis came first. Generosity became debt. Debt became loyalty. Loyalty became a claim on someone else's body. If that person resisted, the family stories changed until resistance looked like betrayal. Rebecca explained why she had stayed silent for years. The divorce had exhausted her, and every attempt to defend herself brought another call, another accusation, another relative demanding that she explain why she had hurt the family after all they had done for her. Silence eventually became the only boundary that left nothing for them to argue with. She allowed me to photograph 3 message threads referring directly to pressure and housing. I wrote down that the images came from Rebecca's archived messages and that she had shown them to me in person. Before we separated, she touched the edge of my folder and said, "Do not spend so much time proving what she is that you forget to decide what you are willing to lose." That warning followed me home. Graham was in the kitchen when I returned. I told him I had met Rebecca. He asked why I would drag her into this. I said I had asked whether Evelyn had used similar pressure before. He said Rebecca hated his family and would say anything. I asked whether he knew Rebecca had donated part of her liver to his father. He said of course he knew. I placed one of the archived messages on the table and asked whether he also knew Evelyn had connected Mercer housing and financial support to Rebecca's willingness to proceed. Graham read the sentence about Mercer security and sacrifice, then said that was Rebecca's version of a terrible period when everyone had been terrified. "Fear keeps getting a lot of permission in this family," I said. He accused me of digging up the worst moments of people under impossible pressure. I asked when impossible pressure became a pattern. He did not answer. Instead, he said I had crossed a line by contacting Rebecca. I realized then that his anger was also about who had the right to speak. The family version of Rebecca had been safe while Rebecca was absent. The real woman had returned with dates. Before going upstairs, Graham said Rebecca had always known how to make his mother look worse than she was. I asked whether the message on the table had been written by Rebecca or by Evelyn. He looked at it again and said nothing. That small silence mattered. For the first time, I saw him run out of softer explanations while the evidence remained exactly where I had placed it. I did not feel victorious. I felt the floor of my marriage giving way one board at a time. That night, I lay awake thinking about Rebecca's question, what was I willing to lose? I had spent most of my adult life believing sacrifice was honorable because it was chosen. I had raised my daughter, Emily, through the end of my first marriage and years when money was tight, and I had been proud of being the woman who kept going without making trouble. Dependable, strong, easy to count on. I had worn those descriptions like medals. Now I saw how easily someone could turn them into handles. 3 days later, the argument in my head became irrelevant when Graham came to the doorway of my home office, pale and shaking. His younger sister Allison had suffered a dialysis-related problem and had been taken to the hospital. He had just received the call. For one instant, Evelyn, the documents, and our marriage disappeared behind the fact that Allison was genuinely sick. She was not a strategy. She was a woman I cared about. I grabbed my purse and asked what we could do. On the drive, Evelyn texted me. She and Graham were going directly to the hospital, but Allison's insurance envelope was inside the white binder in Evelyn's home office. Evelyn asked me to stop there, retrieve it from the medical section, and bring it with me. She sent the alarm code and told me exactly which filing cabinet drawer held the binder. I almost refused because I did not want to be alone in Evelyn's house, but Allison was waiting in a hospital, and the request itself was ordinary enough. I turned toward Evelyn's neighborhood. The house was empty. I entered the code she had sent, went directly to the home office, found the white binder in the specified drawer, and opened only the medical section to look for the insurance envelope. The envelope was tucked behind several clipped pages. My full name was printed across the top page. I stopped. It was a printed email from Graham to Evelyn. Beneath it was a screenshot I recognized immediately from my preliminary donor portal, including the date of my screening and a compatibility-related note I had never sent to Evelyn. I read only the pages containing my name and my information. Graham's email said the preliminary update looked encouraging and that he hoped it would calm his mother. Evelyn's reply told him not to discuss paired exchange with me yet. She wanted to get through the anniversary dinner first. Once everyone knew I was helping Allison, she wrote, it would be harder for me to back away without looking cruel. I read that sentence twice. Not easier for Allison, not clearer for the doctors. Harder for me to back away. Then I saw Graham's response. He did not challenge the plan. He wrote that I hated disappointing people and would probably follow through once the family expected it. I sat down because my knees stopped trusting me. Until that moment, part of me had still protected Graham inside my mind. I had called him weak, frightened of Evelyn, conditioned to keep the peace. I had told myself he was being swept along by his mother's force. The pages in my hands showed something more deliberate. He had given Evelyn my private screening information. He had known paired exchange existed. He had known she wanted public praise to make withdrawal harder. Worst of all, he had handed her the fact that I hated disappointing people because he knew me well enough to know it was true. I did not search Evelyn's office or open unrelated files. I photographed only the pages concerning me that I had encountered while following her directions, returned them to the binder, took Allison's insurance envelope, and left. Inside my car, I locked the doors and sent the photographs to a private email account. Only then did I cry. I cried for the dinner applause, for Graham whispering that I should not embarrass his mother, and for every time he had called this a frightened family's misunderstanding. He had taken something I believed made me kind and given it to Evelyn like instructions for how to corner me. At the hospital, I handed the insurance envelope directly to Graham. He began asking why I looked upset, but Evelyn approached before I answered. I did not confront either of them there. Allison was the patient, and I refused to turn her bedside into another Mercer battlefield. I stayed until Graham told me Allison was stable and being monitored. He had received that update from the clinical staff after Allison allowed him to share it with us. Once I knew she was not in immediate danger, I left. By the time I reached home, 3 messages from Evelyn were waiting. The first asked whether I had found the envelope. The second said the binder looked as though pages had been moved. The third said private family documents were not mine to inspect, and that anyone who removed or copied material from her house would no longer be welcome on Mercer property. I read the message standing in the front hall of the house, controlled by the Mercer Family Trust. For the first time, Evelyn's threat did not make me question my own judgment. It confirmed the pattern Rebecca had shown me. The pressure had never been a single ugly reaction to Allison's illness. It was a system, and Graham had helped operate it. I now possessed Evelyn's own words, showing that she knew about paired exchange and intentionally wanted public expectations to make my refusal harder. I also possessed Graham's words, showing that he had supplied my private medical information and identified my reluctance to disappoint people as leverage. The truth was finally in my hands. So was the knowledge that if I used it, Evelyn could attack the place I lived before I had anywhere else to go. I stood beneath a roof I had called home for 6 years and understood that evidence had shifted power toward me at exactly the moment the largest threat became real. The evidence had shifted power toward me at exactly the moment the largest threat became real. The next morning, I carried my folder into the transplant center and asked to see Dana Ruiz. Until then, I had treated my independent living donor advocate's office as a place for questions. This time I went there to make a decision. I told Dana about Evelyn's public announcement, the housing threat, the message tying Graham's job to my cooperation, the paired exchange information I had confirmed through Mark and Allison, and the pages I had photographed from Evelyn's binder. I showed her only material concerning my own evaluation and the pressure around it. When I reached the email in which Evelyn said public praise would make it harder for me to back away, Dana stopped taking notes and asked whether I wanted to continue as a potential donor. No, I said. The answer came faster than I expected. Dana explained that my withdrawal would be recorded, and that the donor program would not proceed with me under coercive conditions. I signed the required papers and watched her place them in my file. No one congratulated me. A woman at a desk simply recognized that my body belonged to me, and the ordinariness of that respect almost broke me. I sat in my car afterward with both hands on the steering wheel. Allison was still sick. Nothing about my withdrawal changed that. I could care about her and still refuse to let fear, money, housing, or marriage turn surgery into an obligation. I called Graham and asked him to come home early. When he arrived, I told him I had formally withdrawn from donor evaluation. His face went pale. He said I had made a permanent decision during a temporary family crisis. I reminded him the decision was mine, even if everyone involved behaved perfectly. Then, he asked me not to tell Evelyn yet. If we could get through the foundation benefit, he said, maybe he could calm her down and separate the medical issue from the family business. You are still asking me to manage your mother's reaction to a decision about my body. He said he was asking for time. I told him time was what everyone had been using to make my refusal more expensive. His phone rang. Evelyn's name appeared. I heard only Graham's side. Yes, then no, then. I was going to tell you. Afterward, he said the transplant office had canceled my upcoming donor appointment, and Evelyn had learned that the schedule changed. I did not know how she learned it, and I refused to guess. What mattered was that she knew. Her retaliation arrived the following afternoon. A manager for the Mercer Family Trust sent Graham written notice that our favorable occupancy arrangement would end under the existing terms and that we needed to begin planning to vacate. I read the notice at our kitchen table as I would any official document: date, sender, authority, effective language. It did not mention my kidney. It did not need to. Then my phone began filling with messages from relatives who had heard that I had changed my mind after letting Allison depend on me. I knew only what those relatives sent me, not exactly what Evelyn had told them. By evening, Graham showed me draft language Evelyn planned to use at the foundation benefit. She intended to describe a failed family donation and speak about promises disappearing when sacrifice became real. My name was not in the draft, but Graham said Evelyn had told him people would know who she meant. She is daring you to contradict her, I said. That night I opened the closet and looked at the boxes we had never unpacked after moving into the Mercer house. For 6 years I had told myself the place represented stability after the uncertain years following my first marriage. I knew which cabinet stuck in humid weather, which stair creaked, where morning light reached the dining table. None of those ordinary attachments changed the ownership line on the trust documents. I had mistaken familiarity for security. I called Emily, my 21-year-old daughter, and told her only that Graham and I were under serious strain, and I might need to change where I lived. I did not burden her with Allison's medical situation. Emily asked whether I was safe. I told her I was. Then she said, "Mom, you do not have to stay somewhere just because leaving is expensive." After we hung up, I wrote that sentence in my notebook beneath Dana's earlier words about voluntary choice. The people outside the Mercer family kept using such simple language. Inside it, every boundary had somehow required a courtroom argument. The trust notice frightened me, but fear became practical. I photographed our belongings, copied financial records I was entitled to access, checked the savings account I had always kept in my own name, and placed important personal documents in a locked bag at work. I did not move out. Not yet. I was still trying to understand whether my marriage had anything left, besides history and habit. Graham watched me pack copies and asked whether I was preparing to leave him. I told him I was preparing not to be trapped. He said he had never trapped me, then stopped. I asked what he thought would happen if I said no after his mother tied our home and his employment to my cooperation. He said he believed she would calm down eventually. "Was that your plan?" I asked. "Wait until I gave in or wait until she calmed down?" He had no answer. 2 evenings before the benefit, Graham asked me to go with him to Evelyn's house. He said he wanted to tell her to stop discussing my medical decision publicly. I agreed on one condition. I would not negotiate whether my withdrawal was acceptable. Evelyn met us in the formal sitting room. Graham told her my donor decision was private and needed to come out of the benefit remarks. Evelyn asked whether he understood what he was throwing away. She named his management future, the house, his father's legacy, and Allison's trust. Then she looked at me and said I had turned a frightened family into enemies because I needed to feel powerful. I told her I had withdrawn from a voluntary medical process. Nothing more. Graham again asked her to leave me out of the benefit. Evelyn told him that defending me publicly meant choosing me over Allison and over the family that had built his life. Graham went quiet, and I heard the old reflex in that silence. Then Evelyn said she had done nothing except act on information Graham voluntarily gave her. Graham looked at the floor. I asked him to look at me. He did. He told his mother that sharing my preliminary donor information had been wrong. Evelyn said he shared it because he was worried about Allison. Graham answered that it still had not been his information to share. It was the first sentence I had heard from him that did not contain a defense of her afterward. Evelyn's face hardened. She said the benefit would proceed as planned. If I objected to the truth, I was free not to attend. In the car, Graham said he had finally stood up to her. I told him correcting one thing after the evidence became impossible to ignore was not the same as protecting me when doing so required faith in my word. I opened the photographs from the binder. I had not yet shown him the full email chain. I read Evelyn's message aloud. "Wait until after the anniversary dinner. Once everyone knew I was helping Allison, it would be harder for me to back away without looking cruel." Then I showed him his reply saying, I hated disappointing people and would probably follow through once the family expected it. Graham closed his eyes. I asked the question that mattered more than the screenshot. Why did you help her make it harder for me to say no? He said he had been scared for Allison. I waited. He said Evelyn believed paired exchange might be more complicated and testing me seemed direct. I waited again. Finally, he said, I thought if everyone expected it, you would go through with it. The words were not an excuse. They were the mechanism. Graham knew I hated disappointing people. He had watched me apologize for returning bad food and volunteer for extra work because nobody else wanted it. He knew I had spent years trying to earn a secure place in his family without causing trouble. I had believed Evelyn discovered that weakness, and Graham failed to stop her. Instead, he had named it for her. I asked whether he understood what he had admitted. He said he never believed I would be harmed because the doctors would protect me. I told him physical safety was not the only kind. Consent surrounded by humiliation for refusal was not consent. You did not just fail to defend me, I said. You counted on who I am to make me easier to pressure. Graham began crying. I did not comfort him. I simply had nothing left that could make his realization less painful without once again making his pain my responsibility. The next day, he asked me not to attend the foundation benefit. He said Evelyn would use my presence to provoke a confrontation. I asked whether he planned to correct her if she lied about me. He said yes, but only after a pause. I told him I would attend. Evelyn had already used one room full of people to announce a decision I had never made. I would not let another room turn silence into admission. I prepared carefully. I did not bring Rebecca's messages because her history was not mine to expose. I brought Evelyn's message announcing my supposed commitment before my screening was complete. Mark's dated email with his permission, my own donor withdrawal confirmation, and the photographs of the binder pages concerning me. I wanted only enough evidence to keep anyone from turning the night into an argument about memory. The Mercer Family Foundation benefit was held in a hotel ballroom outside Indianapolis. Allison attended only part of the evening because she was still recovering from the recent complication, and Mark stayed beside her. When Allison saw me, she asked whether I was all right. I said yes and asked the same. She said she was tired but glad she had come. Whatever happened next, I would not make her diagnosis the evidence in my case. Evelyn took the stage after the fundraising portion. She spoke about community, family duty, and the way illness revealed character. Then she referred to a living donor plan that had failed after the family had already begun preparing around a promise. She said some forms of heartbreak came from discovering that commitments vanished when sacrifice became real. I felt Graham tense beside me. Someone near the front asked whether she meant Allison's donor. Evelyn looked toward me. Yes, she said. I mean Nora. I stood. I did not walk to the stage. I said I had never consented to donate a kidney. I had agreed to preliminary evaluation. My medical information had been shared without my permission. I had been publicly announced as a donor before I agreed to anything, and I had formally withdrawn after documenting pressure connected to housing, employment, and public shame. I did not discuss Allison's private medical condition. I stated what I knew and how I knew it. Evelyn said I was rewriting events because I had become frightened. I held up the copy of her family message and gave the date, explaining that she announced my supposed commitment before my preliminary screening was complete. She said she believed Graham understood my intention. I looked at him. For several seconds, Graham did nothing. In one future, he could protect the family structure that had paid him, housed him, and taught him that peace meant agreeing with his mother. In the other, he could say something that would cost him that protection and still might not save us. Graham stood. He told the room he had shared my preliminary donor information with Evelyn without my permission. His voice shook, but he continued. He said he had known Mark had explored paired exchange months earlier and that Evelyn knew an alternative pathway had been discussed before she announced me as the solution. Then he admitted the part I had not expected him to say publicly. He had gone along with the announcement because he believed that once the family expected the donation, I would be less likely to back out. The ballroom changed. No one shouted. The silence simply stopped belonging to Evelyn. Allison rose slowly and told her mother not to speak for her. She said I had never promised her a kidney and she did not want anyone using her illness to pressure me. Mark confirmed that he had volunteered months before my screening and that he and Allison had received paired exchange information from the transplant program. He did not claim it guaranteed anything. He did not need to. The issue was no longer which route would succeed. The issue was that Evelyn's claim that I was the only willing path had never been true. Evelyn looked at Graham as if the betrayal belonged to him. She said everything she had done had been for Allison. I could not know exactly what she believed inside herself. I knew only what her own written words showed. She had intentionally tried to make refusal harder for me. Fear did not turn coercion into consent. Graham reached for my hand. I moved mine away. His admission mattered. It broke Evelyn's ability to present the pressure campaign as something I had imagined. It did not restore our marriage. I now knew the central truth. My kindness had not merely been damaged by their plan. My kindness had been part of the plan. They had expected the woman who hated disappointing people to surrender rather than survive being called selfish. Around us, Evelyn's story was coming apart. Allison had reclaimed her own voice. Mark had confirmed the timeline. Graham had admitted his role. I had corrected the lie without exposing medical information that was not mine. For the first time, Evelyn could not make obedience look like the only respectable form of love. But exposure was not resolution. The trust notice still existed. Graham still worked for the Mercer Company. Our marriage still contained the knowledge of what he had done before he found the courage to admit it. When Evelyn stepped down from the stage and looked directly at me, the final question had changed. I no longer had to decide whether I would give the Mercer family part of my body. I had to decide how much of my life I was still willing to leave in their hands. I had to decide how much of my life I was still willing to leave in their hands. The answer did not come in the hotel ballroom. Graham and I drove home separately after the benefit, and when I entered the house, the silence felt different from every other silence we had shared. This one no longer held an argument waiting to be finished. It held a decision waiting for me to make it. Graham arrived 20 minutes later. He found me in the kitchen with the trust notice, my financial folder, and the photographs from Evelyn's binder spread across the table. He said he wanted to fix what he had done. He told me he would speak to his mother again, leave the family company if he had to, and find another place for us to live. Then he asked me to stay while we rebuilt our marriage. I looked at the man I had loved for 6 years and believed that he meant what he was saying in that moment. That was what made my answer difficult. He had finally stood beside me publicly. He had also waited until the truth was impossible to hide. Standing up after you are exposed is not the same as protecting me before anyone knows. I told him. Graham said he understood. I told him I did not think he did yet. If the binder had never fallen open in front of me, if Rebecca had never answered my email, if Mark had never shown me his message, I would still be listening to everyone explain why surrender was the kindest choice. Graham lowered his head. He asked what I wanted. For once, I did not answer with what would hurt everyone least. I said I needed to leave. I rented a small furnished apartment across town using savings I had kept in my own account since before our marriage. It was not beautiful. The living room carpet had been cleaned so many times that it had lost any color I could name, and the kitchen drawers stuck when I pulled them too quickly. But the lease had my name on it. On my second evening there, I sat on the floor eating takeout because the little table had not been delivered yet, and I realized no one could tell me that my right to stay depended on obedience. Before moving the rest of my things, I met with a family law attorney and brought the trust notice, copies of our financial records, and information about the house. I asked questions about separation, my own property, and the difference between living in a family-owned home and having ownership in it. I did not ask the attorney to punish anyone. I wanted to understand exactly what belonged to me and what did not. For years, I had treated legal clarity as something hostile families needed. Now it felt like oxygen. Emily helped me carry boxes on a Saturday morning. My daughter did not ask for every detail, and I was grateful for that. I told her enough to explain why I was leaving. Graham had shared private medical information. His family had tried to make a voluntary decision costly to refuse, and I no longer trusted the marriage enough to live as if nothing had changed. Emily set a lamp on the floor and asked whether I wanted advice. I said no. She smiled and said, "Good, because I was going to tell you to buy better curtains." We laughed, and the sound surprised me. I had spent weeks believing every choice would destroy something. That morning, carrying dishes into a cramped apartment, I felt a life beginning instead. Graham came by 2 days later to bring a box I had left behind. He did not ask to come inside. Standing in the hallway, he told me he had given notice at the Mercer Company. According to him, Evelyn had told him he was throwing away his father's legacy and humiliating the family for a woman who had already left. I could not verify what she had said because I was no longer speaking to her, so I treated it as Graham's account, nothing more. What mattered to me was the decision he could verify. He had resigned. He said he was looking for work outside the family business and had scheduled counseling for himself. I told him those were things he needed to do whether I returned or not. He said he knew. That was the first conversation we had after the benefit, in which he did not ask me to make his next step easier. A week later, Allison called me directly. Graham's younger sister sounded tired but steady. She told me she wanted to apologize for remaining quiet when Evelyn spoke, as if my donation had already been decided. Allison said she had been afraid of losing the help she depended on for appointments and expenses, and every time her mother took over a decision, it had seemed easier to let her. I told Allison that her fear was real, but so was the effect of her silence. She said she understood. Then, without giving me private medical details I had not asked for, she told me she and Mark were continuing conversations with their transplant team about routes that did not involve me. I felt relief, but I stopped myself from turning that relief into responsibility. Allison's treatment belonged to Allison, Mark, and her medical team. I did not need to supervise it to prove that I cared. Before we ended the call, Allison told me she had contacted Rebecca. I was quiet. She said she had spent years believing the family's explanation for why Rebecca left. After the benefit, she started wondering how many other explanations had been shaped by whoever remained in the room after someone else walked away. I told her Rebecca's story belonged to Rebecca, and that Allison should hear it from her if Rebecca chose to speak. Allison agreed. For the first time, I saw what consequences could look like without revenge. I did not have to expose Evelyn to everyone she knew. Once people stopped accepting her version automatically, the old stories began reopening on their own. Evelyn's apology arrived by email several days later. I almost deleted it without reading, but I decided I wanted one clear record of what she was asking from me. She wrote that fear for her daughter had led her to behave more aggressively than she should have. She said she regretted that I felt cornered and acknowledged that the family should have handled communication differently. She did not acknowledge lying about Mark. She did not acknowledge threatening our housing. She did not acknowledge using my preliminary medical information or planning public pressure to make withdrawal harder. At the end, she asked to meet privately so we could put misunderstandings behind us. The old version of me would have gone. I would have prepared sentences in advance, hoping that if I explained the injury perfectly enough, Evelyn would finally admit what she had done. I had spent years believing closure was a confession another person owed me. I read her email twice and understood that I no longer needed one. I replied that I would not meet privately. I told Evelyn I did not want direct contact and that any necessary communication involving the house, belongings, or other legal matters should be made in writing through the appropriate channels. I did not argue about her motives. I did not list every lie. I did not ask her to understand. After sending the message, I blocked her number. My hands shook afterward. Freedom did not feel heroic. It felt like doing something frightening and discovering the world remained standing. The following month was quieter than I expected. Graham and I remained separated. He found temporary work managing leases for a company with no connection to his mother and continued counseling according to what he told me during the limited conversations we still had about practical matters. He apologized more than once, but I stopped measuring change by apologies. When he asked whether there was a chance for us, I told him I did not know. 6 years of marriage deserved more than a decision made out of anger, but betrayal did not disappear because the person responsible finally understood it. If we ever rebuilt anything, I told him, it would happen slowly, and because his behavior stayed different when nobody was watching. He said he accepted that. I did not promise to come back. That distinction mattered. Rebecca emailed me once after Allison contacted her. She said only that they had spoken and that she was glad I got out before. Surgery became another family fact nobody was allowed to question. I thanked her for trusting me when she had every reason not to. I also told her the copies of the messages she had allowed me to keep would remain private unless she ever gave permission otherwise. She replied with 2 words, "Keep choosing." I knew exactly what she meant. For most of my life, I had thought strength meant enduring discomfort without making other people carry it. I had been proud of being useful, reliable, undemanding. None of those qualities were wrong. What I had failed to understand was that a virtue stopped being mine when someone else could invoke it on command. Generosity required the possibility of refusal. Loyalty required choice. Love that could survive only through surrender was not a debt I was obligated to pay. Several months after the benefit, I was still in the apartment. The cheap carpet no longer bothered me. I bought a table, better curtains, and a narrow bookshelf for the wall beside the window. Graham and I met occasionally in public places and spoke carefully. Some days I could imagine a future in which we built something new. Other days I remembered his sentence in the binder and felt the distance return. I allowed both truths to exist. I did not force myself toward forgiveness because uncertainty made other people uncomfortable. The relevant photographs from Evelyn's white binder remained sealed with my attorney, along with the documents concerning the trust dispute and my donor withdrawal. I kept them because evidence still mattered, but I no longer opened them at night to remind myself that what happened had been real. I did not need to keep reopening the wound to prove it existed. One Sunday afternoon, I bought a plain wall calendar for the kitchen. I stood beneath the small clock and opened it to the current month. There were no surgery dates written by Evelyn, no Mercer Foundation benefit, no recovery shifts assigned to relatives, and no boxes dividing my body into someone else's timetable. The only medical appointment I wrote down was my ordinary annual checkup. I wrote it in my own handwriting. Then I looked at the next open Saturday. I wrote dinner with Emily. The square beside it remained empty. Months earlier, an empty space on Evelyn's calendar would have looked like an opportunity waiting for her to fill it with another obligation. Now it looked exactly like what it was, time that belonged to me. I closed the calendar and left it hanging on the wall.